Memphis, 1971. A dying child. A mysterious benefactor. A hospital bill that vanished overnight. For decades, the family whispered about their guardian angel, never knowing his name, never seeing his face. But hospital records don't lie, and neither do the people who were there. What they reveal about Elvis Presley will shatter everything you thought you knew about the king of rock and roll. This isn't about the jumpsuit, the pelvis, or the Vegas years. This is about the man who couldn't watch a child suffer, even if it meant his kindness would die with him. The truth was buried for 50 years. Until now. It was 2:47 a.m. when Patricia Dowling's world collapsed. Her 6-year-old daughter, Amy, lay in the ICU at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, her small chest barely rising with each labored breath. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia, a death sentence in 1971 for families without money, and the Dowlings had nothing left. Patricia's husband had died in Vietnam 8 months earlier. The life insurance had evaporated into funeral costs and overdue rent. Now she sat in that sterile hallway, watching nurses move like ghosts through fluorescent light, knowing that by morning, she'd have to make a choice no mother should face: experimental treatment they couldn't afford, or take Amy home to die in peace. The hospital administrator, a thin man named Gerald Hastings, approached her at dawn with paperwork. "Mrs. Dowling, we need to discuss payment options," he began, his voice professionally sympathetic but firm. Patricia knew what came next: the gentle push toward the exit, the suggestions about making her comfortable, the reality that medicine has always had a price tag. She started to speak, to beg, to promise anything, when Hastings held up his hand. "I'm sorry, I misspoke," he said, and something in his expression had changed. "What I meant to say is that your daughter's treatment has been covered, entirely, by an anonymous donor." Patricia's mind went blank. What? How? Who? The questions tumbled out, but Hastings just shook his head. "I genuinely don't know, ma'am. The payment came through last night. Cash, delivered by courier. Enough to cover everything. The chemotherapy, the hospital stay, the medications, all of it. Whoever did this specifically requested complete anonymity. They don't want to be found or thanked." Patricia collapsed into the chair, tears streaming down her face. Amy would live. Her baby would have a chance. But who saves a stranger's child in the middle of the night? Who has that kind of money just sitting around? And why would they hide it? The answers wouldn't come for decades, but the clues were already there. A nurse named Dorothy Klein had worked the night shift when a man in dark, sunglasses and a pulled-low hat, had walked through the service entrance around midnight. He'd asked which children needed help. When she'd mentioned the Dowling girl, hesitantly, unsure if she should violate privacy protocols, he'd simply nodded and left. 20 minutes later, Gerald Hastings received a phone call from someone who refused to give his name, but whose voice, Hastings would later recall, sounded smooth Southern and strangely familiar. The voice asked about Amy's treatment costs, requested the hospital's wire information, and said something Hastings never forgot: nobody should lose a child because they don't have money. That ain't right. That ain't America. Amy Dowling wasn't an isolated incident. She was part of something much bigger. A underground railroad of mercy that Elvis Presley had been running since the mid-1960s. But because each act was done in absolute secrecy, often through intermediaries or anonymous donations, the pattern remained invisible until researchers began connecting the dots decades later. What they discovered was staggering. Elvis had quietly saved or dramatically improved dozens of lives, spending what would amount to millions in today's dollars, all while ensuring his name never appeared on a single receipt. Joe Esposito, one of Elvis's closest confidants and member of the infamous Memphis Mafia, finally broke his silence in a 2001 interview, years after Elvis's death. People think they knew Elvis because they saw him on TV or bought his records, Esposito said, his voice thick with emotion. They didn't know him. The real Elvis would read the newspaper every morning and circle stories about people in trouble. Kids who needed operations. Families losing their homes. Veterans who couldn't afford prosthetics. Then he'd hand me the paper and say, "Joe, fix this. But don't let anyone know it was me." That was almost daily for years. The mechanics of Elvis's secret charity network were remarkably sophisticated. He'd established relationships with hospital administrators, social workers, and local ministers across Memphis and beyond. When someone in dire need was identified, Elvis would dispatch one of his trusted associates, sometimes Esposito, sometimes his road manager, sometimes even his accountant, to handle the payment. Cash was preferred because it left no paper trail linking back to him. When checks were necessary, they'd come from shell accounts or Elvis's business managers' companies, never directly from him. On several occasions, Elvis himself would deliver the money in person, always in disguise, always after dark, always with the strict instruction that his identity remain secret. But why? Why would someone as famous as Elvis Presley, who could have garnered massive positive publicity from public charity, choose to hide his generosity? The answer lies in something his mother, Gladys, told him when he was young, and they were living in poverty in Tupelo, Mississippi. When you help someone, she'd said, you do it because it's right, not because you want people to think you're good. The minute you start doing good for applause, it ain't good no more. It's just vanity dressed up. Elvis took that lesson to heart. He'd experienced real poverty, the kind where you eat lard sandwiches for dinner and wear cardboard in your shoes to cover the holes. He knew what it felt like to be helpless, to watch his mother work herself sick trying to keep the lights on. When fame and fortune came, he didn't forget that desperation. He tried to cure it, one anonymous donation at a time, one rescued child at a time. And he did it the way his mama taught him, in secret, where pride couldn't contaminate compassion. December 18th, 1970, Birmingham, Alabama. A charity event at the Municipal Auditorium where Elvis was scheduled to perform. But 3 hours before showtime, Elvis wasn't thinking about his setlist or his costume. He was reading a local newspaper article about a house fire that had killed a father and left his widow, Margaret Hayes, with 3 children and third-degree burns covering 30% of her body. The medical bills were astronomical. The community had tried to raise money, but it wasn't nearly enough. Elvis read the article twice, folded the paper carefully, and looked at his manager, Colonel Tom Parker. "I need to see this woman," Elvis said. Parker's face immediately tightened. "You've got a show in 3 hours, Elvis. We've sold 10,000 tickets. You can send her money after." But Elvis was already standing up. "Then we better move fast." What happened next became legend among Elvis's inner circle, but was never reported publicly until decades later. Elvis, disguised in a simple maintenance worker's uniform, borrowed from the venue, walked into Birmingham Medical Center through the loading dock. He'd called ahead, anonymously, to determine Margaret Hayes's room number. He made his way to the burn unit, where she lay heavily bandaged, drifting in and out of consciousness from pain medication. A nurse named Rebecca Thornton was checking Margaret's vitals when she saw a maintenance worker slip into the room. She was about to tell him he was in the wrong place when something about his face stopped her. Even with the cap pulled low and the reading glasses, she knew. Her hand flew to her mouth. Elvis put a finger to his lips, then pulled out an envelope from his jacket, thick with cash, $20,000. He placed it on the bedside table, leaned down, and whispered to the unconscious woman, "Your babies are going to be fine. You're going to be fine. God bless you, ma'am." Then he looked at Nurse Thornton. "She never saw me," he said quietly. "I was never here. But this money is real, and it's hers, and you're going to make sure she gets every penny, aren't you?" Thornton nodded, tears streaming down her face. Elvis touched her shoulder gently and left. He made his show that night. 10,000 people watched him perform Suspicious Minds and Can't Help Falling in Love, and nobody knew that 3 hours earlier he'd been a ghost haunting a hospital hallway, leaving money and miracles in his wake. Margaret Hayes recovered. She used the anonymous donation to pay her medical bills, keep her house, and raise her 3 children, one of whom, Michael Hayes, became a doctor specifically because he wanted to help people the way someone had once helped his mother. Michael spent years trying to discover who had saved his family, pursuing dead ends and closed doors. It wasn't until 2015, when nurse Rebecca Thornton was dying of cancer herself, that she finally told the truth. "It was Elvis," she whispered to Michael. "I kept the secret for 45 years like I promised. But you should know. He loved your mama, and he never even met her. That's the kind of man he was." Not every story has a happy ending, and Elvis learned that painful truth repeatedly throughout his secret charity work. In 1968, he received a letter from a mother in rural Tennessee whose son had been diagnosed with a rare form of bone cancer. Elvis immediately mobilized his resources, paying for the boy to be transferred to the best cancer center in the country, covering all experimental treatments, even flying in specialists from Europe. For 6 months, he followed the case obsessively, calling doctors for updates, praying in private. When the boy died anyway, Elvis locked himself in Graceland for 3 days, inconsolable. His friends said he aged years in those 72 hours, but he didn't stop. If anything, the failures made him more determined. Because for every child he lost, there were others he saved. Children like Amy Dowling, who survived her leukemia, grew up, became a nurse herself, and never knew the name of her guardian angel until 2019, when a journalist investigating Elvis's secret charitable work finally connected the dots. When Amy learned the truth at age 54, she broke down. "I've spent my whole life trying to pay forward what someone did for me," she said through tears. "I became a nurse because I wanted to give other children the chance I got. And now, I know it was Elvis Presley, the Elvis Presley. It doesn't seem real, but it was real. The hospital records proved it. The testimony of nurses and administrators confirmed it. The pattern of anonymous donations that matched dates Elvis was in various cities. All of it pointed to the same conclusion. Elvis Presley had been systematically finding sick children and saving them, spending his money and his time and his emotional energy in a secret crusade against suffering. Dr. Rebecca Lansing, a medical historian who spent 5 years documenting Elvis's charitable work, believes she's identified at least 73 separate cases where Elvis directly intervened to save lives or dramatically improve medical outcomes through anonymous donations. And that's just what we can confirm, Lansing emphasizes. The real number is probably much higher. Elvis went to extraordinary lengths to hide his generosity. He used cash, intermediaries, fake names, shell companies. He did this because he genuinely didn't want credit. This wasn't a PR strategy. It was a spiritual practice. Lansing's research revealed that Elvis often donated to patients regardless of race, religion, or background at a time when the American South was still deeply segregated, and such generosity across racial lines could be controversial. In one particularly moving case from 1972, Elvis paid for the complete medical care of a young African-American boy with sickle cell anemia, a disease that disproportionately affected black communities and was chronically underfunded. The boy's mother, Sarah Jenkins, described years later receiving a phone call from a hospital administrator saying her son's treatment had been sponsored by an anonymous donor who specifically requested we provide the absolute best care, regardless of cost. When she asked who, all the administrator would say was, someone who believes every child deserves a fighting chance. That boy, Darius Jenkins, survived, graduated from medical school, and became a leading researcher in sickle cell disease, developing treatments that have saved thousands of lives. Everything I've accomplished, every life I've touched as a doctor, it all traces back to whoever saved me in 1972, Darius says. When I learned it was Elvis, I understood something important. Generosity multiplies. He saved me. I saved others. They'll save more. That's his real legacy, not the music, as great as that was. It's the lives that continued because he chose to care. Elvis Presley died in 1977, taking his secrets with him. He never publicly acknowledged his charity work, never sought recognition, never wrote about it in his will or memoirs. He did it because suffering offended him, because poverty had once crushed his own family, because his mother taught him that real goodness happens in the dark where no cameras flash. Amy Dowling lived. Margaret Hayes lived. Darius Jenkins lived. They became a nurse, raised 3 children, and pioneered medical research, all because a man in sunglasses walked through service entrances in the middle of the night with envelopes full of cash and a heart too big for his chest. What do you think? Did Elvis's secret charity change how you see him? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you or someone you know is helped by an anonymous donor, tell us your story. Sometimes the greatest gifts come from the shadows.